Welcome to our last chapter, Chapter 15, U.S. Compliance Laws. Learning objective to apply information security standards and U.S. compliance laws to real-world applications in both private and public sectors. Key concepts: what compliance is and how it's related to information security, our overview of the U.S. compliance laws, talk about the NIST Risk Management Framework, RMF, and making sense of laws for information security and compliance. So, U.S. compliance laws. Organizations are entrusted with sensitive data should take steps to protect data, and U.S. doesn't have one comprehensive data protection law. Many federal data protection laws focus on specific types of data and require organizations to use security controls to protect the different kinds of data that they collect, and laws are not optional. Compliance is the law. Organizations collect sensitive data called personally identifiable information, or PII, which includes first name, middle name, last name, home mailing address, social security numbers, driver's license number, financial account data, health data, and biometrics data, authentication credentials. Organizations must follow the laws and regulations, interpret them so that the policies and procedures can be defined, and document policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines on how they're going to comply with these laws. And how are privacy and information security related? So privacy is a person's right to control and use and disclose of his or her own personal information. Control is a person can decide how his or her data can be collected, used, and shared with third parties. And information security is the process used to keep the data private. Security is the process, privacy is the result. Federal information security. Federal government is the largest creator and user of information in the United States. And so government IT systems hold data that are critical for the government, data that is important for running the business of the government, and sensitive military data. Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, of 2002 applies to federal agencies and their IT systems. Federal agencies fall under the executive branch of the U.S. government, and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, is responsible for the compliance to the FISMA Act. So the purpose and main requirements: risk assessment, annual inventory, policies, procedures, subordinate plans, security awareness training, testing and evaluation, remedial actions, incident response, and continuity of operations. So an agency must protect the IT systems, test its IT systems, review the information security controls, apply some types of controls and make sure that they work, and monitor its security risk. This is all required from FISMA. And so it clearly defines the roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, requirements, and practices needed to fully implement FISMA security controls and requirements. NIST. The role of NIST creates guidance that all federal agencies use for their information security programs, creates standards that agencies use to classify their data in IT systems, creates guidance and minimum information security controls for IT systems, and creates federal information processing standards and special publications. So most of this information, though, is good, and that even the private sector, the businesses, we can use this as well. So it's very good information that they provide. Some of it we have access to, some of it we don't, but most of their information is available to us. Risk management framework, and NIST recommends using a risk management framework approach for FISMA compliance. The NIST risk management framework outlines 6 steps to protect federal IT systems. The steps are categorize information systems. The agency must first sort its IT systems based on risk. Select the minimum security controls. An agency must select controls for its IT systems based on their risk category. Implement security controls. An agency must apply controls in certain areas that are specified by NIST. And included in these areas are access controls, contingency planning, incident response. Access security controls for effectiveness. An agency must assess its controls on a continuous basis to make sure that they're effective in reducing risk. Authorize the IT system. for processing, and it must test its systems and approve their operations. An agency specifically must accept the risk of operation prior to allowing a system to operate, and this process used to be known as the FSMA terminology as certification and accreditation. And then continuously monitor security controls. An agency must monitor security controls continuously to make sure that they're effective. They also must document any changes to their IT systems. They must assess changes for new risks and then start the whole process over if the needs for change. National Security Systems, NSS, secure using a risk-based approach, includes systems used for intelligence activities, national defense, foreign policy, military activities, and the Committee on National Security Systems oversees FSMA activities. It uses the same six-step process as outlined in the NIST risk management framework. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, is to contain data protection rules that address security and privacy of personal identifiable health information. Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for the rules and compliance, and its goal is to protect health information, PHI, and it is public protected health information is any individual identifiable information about a person's health, and covers healthcare providers and business associates. Main requirements of HIPAA is to determine how to covered entities must protect the privacy of PHI, and then how they may not use or disclose a person's PHI without his or her written consent. And exceptions allow a covered entity to share a person's PHI without a person's written consent on certain exemptions. And covered entity must inform people about how it uses and discloses its PHI. Main requirements for the HIPAA security rule. It requires covered entities to use security safeguards to protect electronic protected health information, and require covering entities to create an information security program, and required covered entities to use information security principles to protect the electronic protected health information, and use required and addressable safeguards. And here's just some information on the safeguards and addressable specifications, and just a little bit more, right? And HHS oversees compliance with the HIPAA, and HHS delegates this function to the Office for Civil Rights, and the Office for Civil Rights enforces HIPAA compliance. The HITECH Act defined a tiered system for assessing the level of each HIPAA violation, tiers A through D. Tier A, this tier represents violations for which the offender didn't realize that he or she violated the act and would have handled the matter differently if he or she had. The result is a $100 fine for each violation, and the total imposed for such violations cannot exceed $25,000 for the calendar year. Tier B, for violations due to reasonable cause but not willful neglect, this results in a $1,000 fine for each violation, and the fines cannot exceed $100,000 for the calendar year. And then Tier C, for violations due to willful neglect that the organization ultimately corrected, the result is a $10,000 fine for each violation, and the fines cannot exceed $250,000 for the calendar year. And for violations of willful neglect and the organization did not correct, the fine is $50,000 for each violation, and the fines cannot exceed $1.5 million for the calendar year. The Ombudsman Rule provides a catch-all update to HIPAA and the HITECH Act rulings. It tightens requirements for covered entities and business associates. Gramm-Leach-Blye Act, GLBA, right? So this addresses privacy and security of consumer financial information. The Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, FFIEC, is the regulatory community services the U.S. banking community, and FFIEC Council developed a cybersecurity assessment tool used to identify bank or financial institution cybersecurity maturity, and it complements a bank banking or financial organization's ongoing risk management program and cybersecurity implementations. GLB purpose and scope. So it's for scope is financial institutions must follow the GLBA privacy and security rules to help mitigate data breaches and identify theft. And GLB requires financial institutions to protect consumers' non-public financial information, or NPI. NPI is personally identifiable financial information that a consumer gives to a financial institution. Agencies with GLBA oversight and responsibilities: SEC, the Federal Reserve System, the FDIC, the NCUA, the OCC, and the OTS, and then the FTC. Main requirements of GLB privacy rules: you may not share a customer's NPI with non-affiliated third parties. You can share this information only when it first provides the consumer with notice of its privacy practices. Notice must be: you tell customers about the types of the data that the institution collects, state how the institution uses collected information, and describe how the institution protects the consumer's NPI. Privacy rule requires that consumers have a chance to opt out of certain types of data sharing with non-affiliated third parties. It's mainly to protect the security and confidentiality of consumer data, protect against threats to the security of integrity of customer data, and protect against unauthorized access to or use of customer data that could result in harm to a customer, and require a financial institution to create a written information security program. Oversight: so institutions that violate GLB can be subject to both criminal and civil penalties. Monetary fines can be substantial. GLB requires financial institutions to follow privacy and security rules and make sure that your organization's IT systems operate in a way that complies with the law. SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It protects investors from financial fraud and applies to publicly traded companies that must register with the Securities and Exchange Commission's SEC. It requires companies to verify the accuracy of their financial information, and Section 404 requires an organization's executive officers to establish, maintain, review, and report on effectiveness of the company's internal controls over financial reporting. A company must create, document, and test its ICFR. It must report on its ICFR every year. And after a company makes its yearly report, outside auditors must review it to make sure the ICFR works. And ICFR are processes that provide reasonable assurance that an organization's financial reports are reliable. SOX requires publicly traded companies to maintain their financial audit papers for 7 years, including work papers, memorandums, correspondence, electronic records, other records created, sent, or received in connection with the audit, and retain the records and documentation that it uses to assess its internal controls over financial reporting. It is a crime for a person or company to knowingly and willfully violate records retention provisions. In other words, you can be fined if you don't have your paperwork for over 7 years. SEC oversees and enforces most of SOX provisions. The mission is to protect investors and maintain the integrity of the securities industry. It has 5 commissioners who serve 5-year terms, has 11 regional offices in the United States. SOX requires SEC to review a public company's yearly and quarterly reports at least once every 3 years. The Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, right? It affects educational institutions that collect and store student data, and it's related to demographic information, address and contact information, parent demographic information, parent address and contact information, grade information, and disciplinary information. If schools don't receive federal funds, it doesn't have to comply with FERPA. But if it does receive federal funds, it must comply with FERPA. Primary goal is to protect the privacy of students' records, including computer media, video, film, and photos, and includes any records maintained by an outside party acting on the school's behalf. Main requirements. Students or their parents, if the student is under 18, have the following rights: to know what data are in the student's record and the right to inspect and review that record, to request that a school correct errors in the student record, and to consent to have certain kinds of student data released. A school must protect personally identifiable information in student records, and a school cannot release a student's records to a third party without student's written consent. FERPA allows directory information to be disclosed without student consent as long as the student is notified, and schools can do this so long as it has given notice to the students. A student can choose to forbid the release of directory information, though. FERPA oversight. The Family Policy Compliance Office, FPCO, oversees FERPA compliance and has the authority to review and investigate FERPA complaints. Schools that violate FERPA can lose federal funding. Only the Family Policy Compliance Office is allowed to sanction schools that violate FERPA. Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA, requires certain schools and libraries to filter offensive internet content so that anyone under 17 can't access it. Any school or library receiving federal funding from the E-rate program must comply. It covers schools and libraries that they must filter offensive internet content so children can't get to it, and technology protection measures is any technology that can block or filter the objectionable content. Schools and libraries must adopt and enforce an internet safety policy to comply with CIPA, and library or schools must be able to disable the TPM for any adult if the adult needs to use a computer. The FCC has oversight for CIPA, and little oversight action is required. The FCC may require a library to refund the E-rate discount for the period of time it wasn't in compliance. Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, assists merchants and financial institutions in understanding and implementing standards for security policies, technologies, and ongoing processes that protect their payment systems from the reaches of theft and cardholder data. It helps vendors understand and implement PCI standards and requirements for ensuring secure payment solutions are properly implemented. And its purpose is to validate compliance, on-site PCI audits by a qualified security assessor, QSA, quarterly vulnerability assessment scanning performed by an approved scanning vendor, complete an annual self-assessment questionnaire with quarterly vulnerability assessment scanning from an approved scanning vendor. The self-assessment questionnaire lists all security control requirements that are needed for various self-assessment questionnaire levels. And then here's some control objectives and the PCI requirements. And here's some of the requirements. Requirement 3.3, update requirement to clarify that any displays of the primary access number, the 16-digit credit card number, greater than the first 6 or last 4 digits of the primary access number requires a legitimate business need, right? So you just can't display all 16 digits for no reason. You need, they must. Why do they have to have all 16 digits? Your system should mask it out, like so for reps that help you on the phone and assist you. They may only need access to the last 4, or so they may not see all 16 digits. They don't need to. We'll just skip through some of those. And then making sense of the laws for information security compliance. Organizations must comply with federal laws and state laws. As a system security professional, you will possess the skills needed to make sense of these compliance laws, understand how IT systems must be configured in order to meet your organization's compliance requirements, be able to explain how these laws affect IT systems, and then be able to explain the steps that your organization took to be compliant. And here are the laws that we've talked about, or standards, because PCI is not a law, the others are, but they all fit in the confidential integrity and availability, except for SEPA, the Child Internet Protection Act. It's availability, but most of them, FERPA is confidentiality, integrity. FISMA, HIPAA, they're all three. PCI is all three. GLBA is confidentiality and availability. SOX is integrity and availability. And so that is our last chapter. We're done, and we'll see you in the final exam. And good luck.